Okay, so one of the very first things I like to do after I've launched Photoshop, after having just installed it, is I want to set it up so it's a little more conducive to the way I work. And that's going into and modifying the preferences. Now, if you are in fact brand new to Photoshop, you've never launched it before, you're probably going to want to work a little while or develop some habits when you're working in Photoshop and decide which preferences you want to turn on or off. But I just want to go through the preferences so you can perhaps notice some things you want to change right from the get-go, and you'll know where they are for future reference. Now, on a PC, the preferences for Photoshop are actually located under the Edit menu. Now, on a Mac, as we're working on now, they're located under the Photoshop menu. If you go here and then you see that there's the flyout menu and you have all your various preferences, you can access them individually, of course, or you can go right into the General or use the keyboard shortcut Command K. And when we open this up, you'll notice it is a giant window. Now, all those different categories that were in the menu are also in the sidebar here, allowing us to access them all within this one window, and we can set it all up without having to go into each one individually. Now, this first one is the preferences, or the general preferences, rather, and this is, as you'll notice, I'm just going to touch on a few of these. Some of the more pertinent ones that Photoshop users tend to go in here and modify. And the general preferences don't really need much changing unless there are some specific functions that you want to change. Notice there's a number of these that are checked on and off by default, and they're pretty self-explanatory. You can a couple of zoom features here. Up here at the top is some common features that get changed. If you're used to the color picker in your operating system, you can certainly choose that here. Here I can choose the Apple or the Adobe color picker, and you can set your image interpolation. This is also accessible inside your image size when you create a new document, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, the interface options allow you to modify the way Photoshop looks. Here are your screen modes, your various channel and panels. You can determine how they behave and how they view. You can set your languages down here. In the file handling, this is perhaps one of the more frequently visited areas because this determines how Photoshop deals with the files that you create. In the file saving options, you can actually determine how it's going to save a preview, if it's going to save a preview at all. In this case, I've got it set to always save. But you can choose never to save an image preview or ask when you're saving it. You can determine the platform it's going to be saved for, and you can also set it to append file extensions, which I always leave on because it makes it easier, of course, to determine what kind of file you're looking at on your desktop or in a folder or wherever. Now, down here in the file compatibility, we have a button to determine our Camera Raw preferences. If you are a photographer using Camera Raw, you can go in here and determine certain functions for all your Camera Raw files. You can determine your maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. This I've got set to ask. Sometimes I will set it to always. If you're going to be providing files from your version of Photoshop to users who are using earlier versions, perhaps, or if you're using Smart Objects a lot, it will ask you to maximize compatibility depending on stuff you're doing. Then you'll want to have this set to always. But depending on what kind of work you're doing, I would go ahead and leave it on ask. That way you can determine that at the time you're saving the file. It doesn't always do it automatically because you may set up file compatibility when it's not necessary to. So probably leaving it to ask is a good way to go. And here you can enable the version queue, and you can determine your recent files list, which under the file menu, if you go here and you see open recent, this will list the most previous files that you just worked on, and you can determine how many of those are listed in there. If you work on a lot of files, you can increase this number right in there. The next item here is performance. Here's where you determine how much of your RAM, your system's memory, is going to run your system, or how much is going to be allocated to Photoshop to function. And Photoshop is a RAM-hungry piece of software. It really does chew things up, especially if you're working on considerably larger files or a number of files at one time. You'll notice I've got 70% of my RAM allocated to Photoshop, and that's a fair chunk of RAM when you're working in here. Now, if you're working on relatively small files or you're working on web graphics, you can probably drop this number down considerably, but you want to make sure that depending on what type of work you're doing, this is where you'll set up how your RAM behaves with Photoshop. Here you have the history states, and this determines your undos. Basically, in a sense, you have unlimited undos in Photoshop. You can certainly set this number all the way up to 1,000 if you like, and if you have to undo something 1,000 times, and it's probably going to be easier to start over. The reason you want to keep this number relatively low, and we're going to talk about history a little later, where there's another lesson entirely dedicated to using the history. But you want to keep the number relatively low because every time you do something in Photoshop, and somewhere in your hard drive, Photoshop is going to save a version of that, just in case you have to refer back to it if you undo back to that. So it has to save that version somewhere. So setting this number very, very high will give you an unbelievable large file. So keeping that number relatively low is a good idea. GPO settings, you do want to enable your OpenGL drawing if your graphics card is capable. For some of the higher end graphics, perhaps if you're using Photoshop CS3 or CS4 Extended, you want to have it for the 3D capabilities. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And just moving along, cursors, you can determine the behavior, and well, actually the appearance of your cursors. You can have it looking like the actual tool itself, precise, normal. Now, these are functions that will probably develop as you work in the program. I noticed over time that I would use precise, but I seem to like normal brush tip. And here, for the other cursors, I'm going to go ahead and put this on precise, so it gives me a target with a point, so I know exactly what I'm doing with that particular tool. Transparency and gamut determines when you have a file that has transparency and you have no other files, layers beneath it. This is the grid you will see, and that basically represents a transparent area of your document. And you can change the size, colors, and all that stuff right within this window. Units and rulers determines your unit of measure. If you're working in inches, pixels, if you're working in video or web, this is your ideal measurement. Inches for print, and you got others, percentages, all those things are located right in here. And there's a quick and easy way to change your unit of measure while inside the document, and we'll show you that a little bit later on as well. Moving right along, we've got guides and grids, and we'll talk about guides and grids a little bit later, but this is where you would determine how those appear in your document. You have the ability to change the color, because depending on the document you're working on, your guides and grids may blend in, so you're going to have to change the color so you can make them more visible. Now, plugins basically determines if you have an extra plugins folder, you can go ahead and add it in here. Type, this is some very small type features. I've never really had to go in here and change anything. It's these top few that you're probably going to be finding yourself visiting the most. So that's the basic preferences, and I noticed I just changed a few, but as I mentioned, as you're working in Photoshop, you're probably going to discover some that you're going to want to go in here and change and do all that. So one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to preferences is the color preferences, or in this case, the color settings inside Photoshop. Now, under the Edit menu, we're going to go down here to Color Settings. Here's where you determine how Photoshop is going to display your images, what color space and what color profiles it's going to use to display the color images, and it's also going to determine when you bring in or import files into Photoshop, whether it's going to leave them as they are or convert them to your current color profile. Now, the settings here under general settings here, you notice it's set to North America General Purpose 2. Now, this is the default setting, and there was a time when Photoshop, long before digital photography really made it big and was being widely used, mostly Photoshop was being used for very small things like web graphics and such like that, mostly for images that were being displayed on a screen or a television set or something. And this one actually worked really well, but now that digital photography is getting much more prominent and much more widespread than it is, you're going to find that you want to change this to this one right here, which is North America Prepress 2. And notice what happened. A couple of things changed. It changed the RGB color space to RGB 1998. This is going to be the most commonly used color space. Now, you can go ahead and, if you have specific color profiles that you want to develop, you can also choose to load those. They would show up right in here inside your window. You could have a monitor color profile that you can certainly use. But I think you'll find that Adobe RGB is a good place to start, and you'll find that a lot of users use that as well. And these other settings for your other various color spaces will work just fine. Down here at the bottom, you have color management policies, and this is where it determines when you open a file that's been worked on by another person in another version of Photoshop, this is where you determine how it's going to behave. Notice that right now, if you open up an RGB, CMYK, or grayscale file, it's going to preserve the embedded profiles that are existing in that document. However, right here, you've got these items checked on, which are profile mismatches, and it's going to ask you when opening or when pasting if you want to embed that profile or convert it to the working profile that you're in now. So, again, these are going to be habits that you're going to develop over time working inside Photoshop. If you know for a fact you have specific profiles, this is where you would input those and then set them up for your various color spaces. But If you're completely new to Photoshop, as I mentioned, this is a very good place to start if you're going to be working with photographs, especially taken from a digital camera. So, those are the preferences and color settings. On the very next lesson, we're going to talk about the interface and the workspace in Photoshop so you can set it up to make it more conducive to the way you work as well.